Picture this. It's 3 in the morning and you're lying in bed, the glow of your phone illuminating your face as you scroll endlessly through videos of people you've never met, living lives you'll never live, in places you'll never go. Your thumb moves mechanically, swipe after swipe, like a prayer wheel spinning in the hands of a monk. Except this prayer is leading you nowhere but deeper into a digital trance. You tell yourself you'll stop after just one more video, one more post, one more story. But somehow morning arrives and you're still there, trapped in the endless scroll. What if I told you that this exact experience, this modern predicament that affects over 4 billion people worldwide, was perfectly described over 3,000 years ago? Not by Silicon Valley executives or digital wellness experts, but by ancient sages sitting in meditation caves in the foothills of the Himalayas. They didn't have smartphones, of course, but they understood something fundamental about the human mind that we're only now beginning to rediscover. These wise men and women, the rishis of ancient India, identified 3 states of consciousness that trap us in cycles of suffering and keep us from experiencing our true nature. They called these states Tamas, Rajas, and what we often encounter as Raga and Moha. Tonight, I want to take you on a journey through these ancient concepts, not as academic curiosities gathering dust in Sanskrit textbooks, but as living, breathing insights that can help us understand why we can't put down our phones, why we feel so empty despite being more connected than ever, and most importantly, how we can break free. Let me tell you about Maya. No, not the concept of Maya from Hindu philosophy, though we'll get to that. I'm talking about Maya Chen, a 24-year-old software engineer I met last year at a digital wellness retreat in Northern California. Maya came to that retreat because she'd realized something terrifying. She was spending over 11 hours a day looking at screens. 11 hours. That's more time than she spent sleeping. More time than she spent with actual human beings. More time than she spent doing anything else in her life. Maya was brilliant, successful by conventional standards, and completely miserable. She'd wake up and immediately reach for her phone before her feet even hit the floor. She'd check Instagram while brushing her teeth, scroll through Twitter during her commute, toggle between Slack and TikTok during work breaks, and fall asleep, watching YouTube videos about productivity tips that she never actually implemented. Sound familiar? But here's what made Maya's story particularly fascinating to me. She wasn't just mindlessly consuming content. She was actively creating it too. She had a successful Instagram account where she shared her coding journey, with over 50,000 followers hanging on her every tutorial and career tip. The irony was exquisite and heartbreaking. Here was someone teaching others about success and productivity while being completely enslaved by the very platforms she was trying to master. Maya told me something during one of our conversations that still gives me chills. She said, "I feel like I'm living 3 different lives, and none of them are real. There's the person I am online, the person people think I am because of what they see online, and the person I actually am when I'm alone. And I'm not even sure that last person exists anymore." This is where our first Sanskrit word enters the story, though Maya had never heard of it. The ancient sages would have looked at Maya's condition and immediately recognized what they called Tamas, pronounced Tamas. Now, Tamas isn't just laziness or inertia, though that's how it's often translated. Tamas is a much more subtle and pervasive state of consciousness. It's the quality of mind that keeps us stuck in patterns that don't serve us, even when we know better. It's the gravitational pull toward numbness, toward the path of least resistance, toward mindless consumption rather than conscious creation. Think about it. When you're scrolling through social media, are you actively choosing each piece of content you consume? Are you deliberately seeking out information that will improve your life, deepen your relationships, or expand your understanding of the world? Or are you simply letting the algorithm feed you whatever it thinks will keep you engaged for the longest possible time? That's tamas in action. It's not evil or wrong, it's simply a state of consciousness where we've handed over our agency to external forces. The ancient texts describe tamas as being like thick fog that obscures our vision. We can't see clearly where we're going, so we just keep moving in whatever direction seems easiest. In Maya's case, the fog was so thick that she'd lost sight of her own desires, her own values, her own sense of what actually brought her joy and fulfillment. The phone had become her compass, and it was pointing her in circles. But tamas isn't the only force at play in our digital lives. There's something else happening, something the ancient sages called rajas, pronounced rajas. If tamas is the fog, rajas is the wind that whips through that fog, creating turbulence, restlessness, and an insatiable hunger for more. Rajas is the quality of mind that's always seeking the next thing, the next hit, the next notification, the next piece of stimulation. Maya experienced rajas every time she posted something online, and then compulsively checked for likes, comments, and shares. She'd publish a coding tutorial and then refresh her Instagram feed dozens of times over the next few hours, watching the numbers climb, feeling a little rush of dopamine with each heart icon and comment notification. But the satisfaction never lasted. 500 likes felt amazing until she saw someone else get 1,000. 1,000 likes felt incredible until her next post only got 800, and she wondered what she'd done wrong. This is rajas in its purest form, the mind caught in constant motion, always comparing, always seeking, never satisfied with what is. The ancient texts describe rajas as being like a fire that consumes whatever fuel you give it, but is never satisfied. You feed it attention, validation, stimulation, new experiences, and it just burns hotter and demands more. Here's what's fascinating about rajas in the context of social media. The platforms are literally designed to trigger and exploit this state of consciousness. Every notification is a gust of rajasic wind. Every infinite scroll is an invitation to keep seeking without ever finding. Every algorithmic recommendation is a promise that the next piece of content will be the one that finally satisfies us. But of course, it never is. Maya began to notice this pattern during her time at the retreat. She'd left her phone in her cabin and was participating in a day of digital silence, and she became acutely aware of how many times her hand automatically reached for her pocket. Every few minutes, her nervous system would generate this little spike of anxiety, this feeling that she was missing something important, that somewhere in the digital world, something was happening that required her immediate attention. That's rajas, the mind's addiction to stimulation and its terror of stillness. But there's a third element to this ancient framework that perhaps cuts even deeper than tamas and rajas. The sages called it moha, pronounced moha, and it's perhaps the most insidious of the three, because it disguises itself as wisdom while leading us further from truth. Moha is often translated as delusion or attachment, but it's more specific than that. Moha is the tendency of the mind to mistake the temporary for the permanent, the superficial for the profound, the symbol for the reality it represents. Maya's relationship with her online persona was a perfect example of moha in action. Over the years, she'd crafted this image of herself as the successful, confident, always learning software engineer. Her Instagram feed was a carefully curated highlight reel of her achievements, her growth, her insights, and slowly, gradually, she began to believe that this curated version of herself was who she really was. She started making life decisions based not on what felt authentic to her inner self, but on what would look good in her next post. She chose restaurants because they were photogenic. She attended events not because she was genuinely interested, but because they would add to her professional brand. She even chose her apartment partly because it had good natural lighting for selfies. The image had become more real to her than the reality it was supposed to represent. This is moha, the confusion between the map and the territory, between the performance of life and life itself. The ancient sages understood that moha is particularly dangerous because it feels so reasonable. Unlike tamas, which we can recognize as stagnation, or rajas, which we can identify as restlessness, moha often masquerades as success, growth, and connection. Maya thought she was building meaningful relationships with her followers, and in some cases, she was. But she was also building a prison of expectations and comparisons that was slowly strangling her authentic self. Now, before we go any further, I want to pause here and acknowledge something important. These aren't just abstract philosophical concepts from a bygone era. Tamas, rajas, and moha are precise descriptions of psychological states that modern neuroscience is only beginning to understand. When researchers study social media addiction, when they examine the dopamine pathways that keep us reaching for our phones, when they investigate the psychological impact of constant comparison and validation seeking, they're essentially studying what the ancient sages mapped out thousands of years ago. But here's where the story gets really interesting, because Maya's journey doesn't end with recognition of these patterns. That's where it begins. You see, the ancient sages didn't identify tamas, rajas, and moha just to catalog different types of suffering. They understood these forces so deeply because they'd discovered how to work with them, how to transform them, and ultimately, how to transcend them. The breakthrough came for Maya during a meditation session on the third day of the retreat. She was sitting quietly, focusing on her breath, when she suddenly became aware of a thought arising in her mind. I should share a photo of this meditation session. It would be great content for my mindfulness series. And in that moment, she saw the absurdity of it all. Here she was, trying to find peace and presence, and her first instinct was to turn even that into content for digital consumption. But instead of judging herself for having that thought, instead of pushing it away or getting frustrated, She simply observed it with curiosity. She watched as her mind generated this impulse to document and share, and she recognized it as rajas, the restless seeking energy that couldn't simply be present with an experience without wanting to do something with it, to turn it into something else. And then she noticed something else. Underneath the Rajasic impulse to create content was a deeper assumption. The assumption that the meditation session was only valuable if it could be shared, if it could generate likes and comments and engagement. This was moha at work. The delusion that external validation was a measure of internal worth, that the digital echo of an experience was somehow more real than the experience itself. And beneath both of these mental movements was something even more subtle. A kind of mental heaviness, a resistance to simply being present with what was actually happening in that moment. She recognized this as tamas, the gravitational pull toward unconsciousness, toward going through the motions without fully engaging with life. This recognition didn't immediately solve Maya's relationship with technology, but it gave her something invaluable, a map. For the first time, she could see the landscape of her own mind clearly enough to navigate it consciously. She began to understand that breaking free from digital addiction wasn't just about willpower or time management. It was about understanding the fundamental forces that drive human consciousness and learning to work with them skillfully. The ancient texts tell us that tamas, rajas, and moha aren't problems to be eliminated. They're energies to be understood and transformed. Tamas, the force of inertia and resistance, can be transformed into stability and grounding. Rajas, the force of restless seeking, can become focused action and creative energy. And moha, the force of attachment and delusion, can evolve into discernment and wisdom. But this transformation requires what the sages called Vivika, pronounced Vivika, which means discriminating wisdom. Vivika is the ability to distinguish between what serves our highest good and what merely serves our impulses. It's the capacity to pause between stimulus and response and choose consciously rather than react automatically. Maya began practicing Vivika in small ways. Before picking up her phone, she would pause and ask herself, "What am I actually seeking right now?" Sometimes the answer was information. She needed to check the weather or respond to an important message. Sometimes the answer was connection. She genuinely wanted to see how a friend was doing or share something meaningful. But more often than not, the answer was that she wasn't seeking anything specific at all. She was just avoiding something else. Boredom, anxiety, loneliness, the discomfort of being alone with her thoughts. This kind of honest self-inquiry is what the ancient practice of Svadhyaya, pronounced Svadhyaya, is all about. Svadhyaya literally means self-study. But it's not the kind of study you do with books and lectures. It's the ongoing investigation of your own mind, your own patterns, your own relationship to desire and aversion, attachment and resistance. Maya discovered that her phone had become what the ancient texts call a vritti, pronounced vritti, a mental modification or fluctuation that kept her consciousness agitated and scattered. The constant stream of notifications, updates, and stimuli was like throwing pebbles into a still pond. Each disturbance created ripples that prevented her from seeing clearly to the bottom. The practice of meditation, the ancient sages tell us, is about learning to still these mental modifications so that consciousness can settle into its natural state of clarity and peace. They called this state sattva, pronounced sattva, which means clarity, harmony, and balance. When the mind is in a sattvic state, we can see situations clearly, respond rather than react, and make choices that align with our deepest values rather than our surface impulses. But achieving sattva isn't about suppressing tamas and rajas, it's about transforming them. Maya began to experiment with what she called conscious consumption. Instead of mindlessly scrolling through her feeds, she would set specific intentions before opening any app. I'm looking for inspiration for my next project, or I want to check in with my friends, or I'm seeking information about this specific topic. This simple practice began to transform her relationship with technology almost immediately. When she approached her devices with intention rather than habit, she found that she naturally spent less time on them and felt more satisfied with the time she did spend. The quality of her attention changed. Instead of being scattered across dozens of random pieces of content, her focus became more concentrated and purposeful. But the real breakthrough came when Maya began to apply these ancient principles not just to her consumption of digital content, but to her creation of it as well. She realized that her motivation for posting had been largely driven by rajas, the restless, seeking for validation, attention, and external confirmation of her worth. Even her educational content, while genuinely helpful to others, was often created from a place of ego-driven ambition rather than genuine service. She began to experiment with what the ancient texts call nishkama karma, pronounced nishkama karma, which means action without attachment to results. Instead of posting with the expectation of getting a certain number of likes or comments, she began creating content simply because it felt authentic and potentially helpful, then releasing it into the world without clinging to how it was received. This shift was subtle but profound. Her content didn't become less engaging. In fact, many of her followers commented that her recent posts felt more genuine and relatable. But Maya's internal experience was completely different. She was no longer riding the emotional roller coaster of digital validation. Her sense of self-worth became less dependent on external metrics and more grounded in her own inner knowing. The ancient principle behind this transformation is called dharma, pronounced dharma. Dharma is often translated as duty or righteousness, but it's more accurately understood as aligned action. Action that flows from our deepest nature rather than from our ego's demands for recognition and achievement. When we act from dharma, the sages tell us the action itself becomes a form of spiritual practice, regardless of its external results. Maya began to see her work as a software engineer, her content creation, and even her social media presence as opportunities to practice dharma. Instead of asking, what will get the most engagement, she began asking, what would be most helpful? What would be most honest? What would be most aligned with my values? This shift in orientation began to affect every aspect of her life. Her relationships became more authentic because she was less concerned with managing her image and more focused on genuine connection. Her work became more fulfilling because she was guided by intrinsic motivation rather than external pressure. Even her leisure time became more satisfying because she was choosing activities based on what actually brought her joy rather than what would look good online. But perhaps the most significant change was in her relationship with what the ancient texts call santosha, pronounced santosha, which means contentment or satisfaction. Maya began to notice that the constant seeking, the endless scroll, the perpetual comparison with others was rooted in a fundamental dissatisfaction with the present moment. She was always looking for something better, something more, something different from what was actually here right now. The practice of santosha isn't about becoming passive or complacent. It's about finding a deep sense of okayness with what is, even while working skillfully to improve what can be improved. It's the difference between seeking because you feel incomplete and acting because you're inspired to contribute. Maya discovered that when she could find santosha in small moments, the taste of her morning coffee, the feeling of solving a challenging coding problem, the simple pleasure of a conversation with a friend, her compulsive need for digital stimulation began to naturally decrease. She wasn't forcing herself to stay off her phone. She was simply finding more satisfaction in direct, unmediated experience. The ancient sages understood something that modern psychology is just beginning to recognize: that sustainable change doesn't come from willpower or external restrictions. It comes from shifting the fundamental orientation of consciousness. When we're operating from tamas, rajas, and moha, we are driven by unconscious forces that keep us trapped in patterns of suffering. But when we can cultivate sattva, when we can act from dharma, when we can find santosha in the present moment, our choices naturally align with our well-being. This doesn't mean that Maya abandoned technology entirely. She still maintains her social media presence, still creates content, still uses digital tools for work and communication. But her relationship with these tools has been fundamentally transformed. She uses them consciously rather than being used by them. She creates from inspiration rather than compulsion. She connects authentically rather than performing for approval. The ancient practice that supported this transformation is called yoga. And I don't mean the physical postures that most Westerners associate with the word. Yoga literally means union or yoke, and it refers to the practice of aligning our individual consciousness with universal consciousness, our personal will with the deeper intelligence that governs all of life. In practical terms, yoga is about bringing conscious awareness to everything we do: eating, working, relating, even scrolling through social media. When we approach our activities with yogic awareness, we begin to see how our choices either contribute to our freedom or reinforce our bondage. Maya began to treat her entire relationship with technology as a yoga practice. Each time she reached for her phone, each time she posted something online, each time she felt the urge to check for notifications. These became opportunities to practice conscious choice rather than unconscious reaction. She developed what she called digital dharana, using the Sanskrit word dharana, pronounced dharana, which means concentration or focused attention. Instead of letting her attention be scattered across multiple apps and feeds, she would practice sustained focus on one thing at a time. When she was coding, she was fully present with the code. When she was scrolling through Instagram, she was consciously engaging with each post rather than mindlessly consuming. This practice of one-pointed attention began to spill over into every area of her life. Her relationships deepened because she was more present in conversations. Her work improved because she could maintain focus for longer periods. Even her enjoyment of simple pleasures increased because she wasn't constantly multitasking or thinking about what to do next. The ancient texts describe this state of sustained attention as a doorway to what they call dhyana, pronounced dhyana, which is often translated as meditation, but really means effortless awareness. When dharana is perfected, when we can maintain focused attention without strain or force, consciousness naturally settles into a state of clear, spacious awareness. Maya began to experience moments of dhyana not just during formal meditation, but throughout her daily life. While walking, while cooking, while working on challenging code, while having meaningful conversations, there would be these spontaneous moments when her mind became perfectly still and clear, when she felt completely present and connected to the flow of life. These moments weren't ecstatic or dramatic. They were more like coming home to herself, like remembering who she really was, beneath all the digital noise and mental chatter. In these moments, the compulsive need to document and share the experience simply wasn't there. The experience itself was complete and satisfying, without needing to be transformed into content or validated by others. The ancient sages tell us that this natural state of clear awareness is our birthright. It's not something we need to achieve or attain, but something we need to remember and return to. They called this state samadhi, pronounced samadhi, which means absorption or unity consciousness. But here's the beautiful thing about Maya's journey. She didn't need to retreat from the world or abandon technology to touch these deeper states of consciousness. She discovered that it was possible to live a fully engaged, creative, connected life while remaining rooted in this deeper awareness. In fact, her work as a software engineer became more innovative and effective because she was approaching it from a clearer, more focused state of mind. Her content creation became more authentic and impactful because it was arising from genuine insight rather than ego-driven ambition. Her relationships became more nourishing because she was present and available rather than distracted and scattered. The ancient principle that guided this integration is called karma yoga, the path of action in the world as spiritual practice. Karma yoga teaches us that it's not what we do that determines our spiritual development, but how we do it, the quality of consciousness we bring to our activities. Maya began to see every aspect of her digital life as an opportunity to practice karma yoga. Writing code became a meditation on precision and clarity. Creating content became an offering of service to others. Even scrolling through social media became a practice of mindful awareness and conscious choice. This shift in perspective transformed what had once been sources of stress and addiction into vehicles for growth and self-discovery. She was no longer fighting against technology or trying to escape from it. She was learning to dance with it consciously and skillfully. The deeper teaching here is that the path to freedom doesn't require us to reject the tools and technologies of our time. It requires us to transform our relationship with them. The ancient sages faced their own versions of tamas, rajas, and moha. their own tendencies toward unconsciousness, compulsive seeking, and attachment to illusion. They developed practices and principles for working with these universal aspects of human consciousness that are just as relevant today as they were 3,000 years ago. Maya's story is remarkable, not because she achieved some superhuman level of digital discipline, but because she discovered how to bring ancient wisdom into practical relationship with modern challenges. She learned to recognize Tamas as the gravitational pull toward unconscious consumption, Rajas as the restless seeking for external validation, and Moha as the confusion between image and reality. More importantly, she learned how to transform these forces into sattva, dharma, and santosha. Clarity, aligned action, and contentment. The practices that supported this transformation, Vivika, Svadhyaya, Dharana, Dhyana, Karma Yoga, these aren't esoteric techniques reserved for monks and mystics. They're practical tools for anyone who wants to live more consciously in our hyperconnected world. Think about your own relationship with technology for a moment. How often do you reach for your phone without any specific intention? How often do you find yourself scrolling mindlessly through feeds, looking for something, but not knowing what? How often do you post something online and then compulsively check for reactions? These aren't character flaws or personal failings. They're natural expressions of tamas, rajas, and moha in the digital age. The ancient sages would have recognized these patterns immediately, not as moral problems to be judged, but as workable aspects of consciousness to be understood and transformed. The first step is always awareness, what the ancient texts call sakshi bhava, pronounced sakshi bhava, which means the witness consciousness. Before we can transform our patterns, we need to see them clearly without judgment or reactivity. We need to become curious about our own minds, interested in our own conditioning, fascinated by the subtle ways that unconscious forces shape our choices. Maya discovered that simply bringing conscious awareness to her digital habits began to change them naturally. When she noticed herself reaching for her phone out of habit, she would pause and ask, "What am I actually seeking right now?" When she felt the urge to post something, she would check, is this arising from authentic expression or from a need for validation? When she found herself scrolling endlessly, she would inquire, am I seeking information, connection, or just avoiding being present with myself? This kind of gentle self-inquiry, practiced consistently over time, began to create what the ancient texts call buddhi, pronounced buddhi, which means discriminating wisdom, or higher intelligence. Buddhi is the faculty of consciousness that can distinguish between what serves our well-being and what merely serves our conditioning. As Maya cultivated buddhi in her relationship with technology, she began to make more conscious choices about how she spent her time and attention. She started curating her social media feeds more intentionally, unfollowing accounts that triggered comparison or negativity, and following accounts that inspired growth and learning. She established specific times for checking messages and social media rather than being constantly available to every notification. But the most significant changes were internal. She began to find what the sages call Atma Santosha, pronounced Ajtama Santosha, which means satisfaction in the self. Instead of seeking fulfillment through external stimulation and validation, she was discovering a source of contentment and joy that wasn't dependent on circumstances or other people's approval. This didn't happen overnight. The patterns of tamas, rajas, and moha are deeply ingrained in human consciousness, and they're reinforced by technologies specifically designed to trigger and exploit them. But Maya discovered that consistent practice, guided by ancient wisdom and supported by genuine community, could gradually shift the fundamental orientation of consciousness. She began connecting with others who were on similar journeys, people who were interested in bringing mindfulness and intentionality to their relationship with technology. They formed what they called a digital Dharma Sangha, using the Sanskrit word Sangha, pronounced Sangha, which means spiritual community. This Sangha became a source of support, accountability, and inspiration. They would share insights about their digital practices, support each other through challenges, and explore together how ancient wisdom could be applied to contemporary life. Maya discovered that transformation is much easier and more sustainable when it's supported by community. The ancient principle of Sangha recognizes that we don't evolve in isolation. We're social beings who influence and are influenced by those around us. When we surround ourselves with people who share our values and aspirations, their energy and example naturally support our own growth. Maya's digital Dharma Sangha experimented with group practices, collective digital Sabbaths, mindful social media challenges, shared meditation sessions conducted online, but approached with full presence and intention. They discovered that technology could actually support spiritual practice when approached consciously and used skillfully. This points to something profound that the ancient sages understood. The goal isn't to escape from the world, but to transform our relationship with it. The same technologies that can trap us in tamas, rajas, and moha can also support us in cultivating sattva, dharma, and santosha when we approach them with wisdom and skill. Maya began to see her entire life as what the ancient texts call sadhana, pronounced sadhana, which means spiritual practice. Sadhana isn't something you do for an hour in the morning. It's an orientation toward life that treats every moment as an opportunity for growth, awareness, and service. Her morning routine became a practice of setting intentions for the day. Her work became a practice of bringing excellence and integrity to whatever task was at hand. Her social media engagement became a practice of authentic communication and genuine service to her community. Even her leisure time became a practice of conscious choice and mindful enjoyment. This holistic approach to spiritual practice is what the ancient tradition calls integral yoga, the recognition that every aspect of life can be transformed into a vehicle for awakening when approached with the right understanding and intention. The results of this transformation rippled out into every area of Maya's life. Her relationships became deeper and more authentic. Her work became more creative and fulfilling. Her sense of purpose became clearer and more compelling. She began to experience what the ancient texts call ananda, pronounced ananda, which means bliss or deep joy. But this wasn't the bliss of constant happiness or perpetual excitement. It was the deeper satisfaction that comes from living in alignment with your true nature. It was the joy of conscious choice, authentic expression, and meaningful contribution. It was the peace that comes from no longer being driven by unconscious forces or external pressures. Maya's story illustrates something crucial about the nature of spiritual transformation in the digital age. The path to freedom doesn't require us to reject the tools and opportunities of our time. It requires us to approach them with greater consciousness and skill. The same principles that guided seekers toward liberation 3,000 years ago can guide us toward freedom today. The ancient sages mapped out the territory of human consciousness with extraordinary precision and detail. They identified the forces that keep us trapped in suffering and the practices that lead to liberation. Their insights weren't limited to their particular time and culture. They were discoveries about the fundamental nature of mind and the universal principles of conscious living. When we understand tamas, rajas, and moha as precise descriptions of psychological states rather than abstract philosophical concepts, we can begin to work with them skillfully. When we recognize that our digital addictions are expressions of these ancient patterns, we can apply time-tested practices to transform them. The path forward isn't about perfect digital discipline or complete technological abstinence. It's about bringing conscious awareness to our choices and gradually aligning our actions with our deepest values and aspirations. It's about transforming the quality of our attention from scattered to focused, the motivation for our actions from ego-driven to service-oriented, and our relationship with results from attachment to surrender. Maya's journey continues to unfold. She still faces moments of unconscious scrolling, still sometimes gets caught in the comparing mind, still occasionally finds herself posting from ego rather than authenticity. But she has tools now, ancient tools that have been tested by thousands of generations of seekers. She has the awareness to recognize when she's operating from tamas, rajas, or moha, and the skill to gently redirect her consciousness towards sattva, dharma, and santosha. She has practices that support her in staying present and intentional. She has community that encourages and inspires her growth. Most importantly, she has direct experience of what it feels like to live with greater freedom and consciousness. She knows the difference between being driven by unconscious forces and choosing from awareness. She has tasted the satisfaction that comes from authentic expression and genuine service. This is what the ancient tradition offers us. Not escape from the complexities of modern life, but the tools to navigate them with wisdom, skill, and grace. The sages who sat in meditation caves thousands of years ago were exploring the same fundamental questions we face today. How do we find peace in the midst of chaos? How do we stay true to ourselves in a world of constant pressure and distraction? How do we use our time and energy in ways that serve our highest potential? Their answers, encoded in Sanskrit words like tamas, rajas, moha, sattva, dharma, and santosha, aren't relics of the past. They're practical guidance for the future. They offer us a way to engage fully with the opportunities and challenges of our time while remaining rooted in the timeless wisdom of conscious living. But let me share with you some of the more specific practices that Maya and her digital Dharma Sangha developed, because these insights become truly powerful when we move from understanding to application. Remember, the ancient sages weren't just philosophers. They were scientists of consciousness who developed precise methodologies for transforming human awareness. One of the most profound practices Maya discovered was what she called the pause protocol. Every time she felt the urge to reach for her phone, she would pause and take 3 conscious breaths. During these breaths, she would silently ask herself 3 questions, each connected to one of the ancient principles we've been exploring. First breath. Am I operating from Tamas right now? This question helped her recognize when she was reaching for her phone out of numbness, avoidance, or unconscious habit. Sometimes the answer was yes. She was feeling anxious about a work deadline and wanted to escape into the endless scroll. Sometimes she was feeling lonely and seeking the artificial comfort of digital connection. Sometimes she was simply on autopilot, reaching for stimulation without any real intention. Second breath. Am I operating from Rajas right now? This question revealed when her phone reaching was driven by the restless, seeking mind. Was she looking for that next hit of dopamine from notifications? Was she comparing herself to others and seeking validation through social media metrics? Was she in that agitated state where stillness felt impossible and she needed constant input to quiet her internal restlessness? Third breath. Am I operating from moha right now? This was often the most revealing question because moha is so subtle and sophisticated in its deceptions. Was she confusing her online persona with her authentic self? Was she about to document an experience instead of fully living it? Was she seeking digital connection as a substitute for real intimacy and presence? What Maya discovered was that this simple 3-breath practice began to create what the ancient texts call antardarshan, pronounced antardarshan, which means inner seeing or insight. By consistently bringing conscious awareness to these unconscious patterns, she began to see the machinery of her own mind with unprecedented clarity. But recognition was only the beginning. The ancient tradition provides specific practices for transforming each of these states of consciousness, and Maya began experimenting with what she called conscious replacements for each pattern. When she recognized Tamas in her relationship with technology, that heavy, numbing, avoidant quality, she would practice what the ancient texts call tapas, pronounced tapas. Now, tapas is often translated as austerity or discipline, but it's really about generating conscious heat or energy to break through inertia. Instead of reaching for her phone when she felt that tamasic pull toward numbness, Maya would do something that required conscious engagement. Sometimes this meant taking a walk outside and really paying attention to her surroundings. The feeling of her feet on the ground, the quality of light, the sounds around her. Sometimes it meant doing a few minutes of physical movement to literally shake off the mental lethargy. Sometimes it meant sitting quietly and feeling whatever emotion she'd been trying to avoid through digital distraction. The key insight here is that tamas isn't overcome by force or willpower. It's transformed by bringing gentle, conscious energy to whatever we've been avoiding. Maya discovered that her compulsive phone checking was often a way of avoiding deeper feelings: boredom, loneliness, anxiety, sadness, even joy. By learning to stay present with these feelings instead of immediately seeking distraction, she began to develop what the ancient texts call sahana shakti, pronounced Sahana Shakti, which means the power of endurance or the capacity to be with what is. When Maya recognized rajas in her digital patterns, that restless, seeking, never satisfied quality, she would practice what the ancient sages called pranayama, pronounced pranayama. Pranayama is often translated as breathing exercises, but it literally means extension of life force or restraint of the vital energy. The specific technique Maya used was beautifully simple. She would take a long, slow inhale for a count of 4, hold her breath for a count of 4, then exhale slowly for a count of 8. This particular rhythm has a naturally calming effect on the nervous system, but more importantly, it gave her rajasic energy, something constructive to focus on, instead of seeking the next notification or stimulus. What's fascinating about this practice is that it works with rajas rather than against it. The seeking, active quality of rajas gets channeled into conscious breath control instead of unconscious digital consumption. Maya found that after just a few rounds of this breathing pattern, her need for external stimulation would naturally decrease, and she could engage with technology, or choose not to, from a place of clarity rather than compulsion. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Maya's practice was how she learned to work with moha, that subtle delusion that confuses the symbol with the reality, the performance with the authentic experience. The ancient tradition has a specific practice for this called Netti, pronounced Netti, Netti, which literally means not this, not this. Netti is a practice of discrimination, of learning to distinguish between what is real and lasting versus what is temporary and superficial. Maya began applying this principle to her entire digital life. When she found herself crafting the perfect caption for a photo, she would pause and ask, is this authentic expression or is this performance? When she felt excited about getting likes on a post, she would inquire, is this genuine connection or is this digital validation? The practice wasn't about judging these experiences as wrong or bad. It was about seeing them clearly for what they were. A like on Instagram is not the same as a warm hug from a friend. A carefully curated feed is not the same as a life lived with depth and meaning. Virtual connection is not the same as intimate presence with another human being. This discrimination, practiced consistently, began to naturally reorient Maya's values and priorities. She didn't have to force herself to spend less time on social media. She simply began to prefer direct, unmediated experience because she could feel the qualitative difference. The ancient texts describe this as developing Vivika, pronounced Vivika, discriminating wisdom that can distinguish between what serves our highest good and what merely serves our conditioning. But Maya's journey took an even more interesting turn when she began to explore how these ancient principles could transform not just her consumption of digital content, but her creation of it as well. She realized that the same three forces, Tamas, Rajas, and Moha, were operating in her content creation, and that understanding them could help her create more authentic and impactful work. Tamasic content creation looked like posting out of habit rather than inspiration, recycling old ideas without bringing fresh insight, or creating content that numbed and distracted rather than educated or inspired. Maya began to notice when her content creation was coming from this heavy, unconscious place, and she developed practices to shift into a more conscious creative state. She would begin each content creation session with what she called creative pranayama, a few minutes of conscious breathing to center herself and connect with her genuine intention. She would ask herself, what do I really want to share? What insight or experience might be helpful to others? How can I create from a place of service rather than self-promotion? Rajasic content creation was more subtle. It looked like creating content primarily for external validation, constantly checking metrics and adjusting her message based on what got the most engagement, or feeling driven to post frequently without regard for quality or authenticity. Maya learned to recognize when her content creation was coming from this restless, seeking energy, and she developed practices to transform rajas into focused creative action. One of her most effective techniques was what she called creative dharana, using that Sanskrit word we explored earlier that means one-pointed concentration. Instead of creating content while simultaneously checking other apps, responding to messages, and monitoring engagement, she would practice sustained focus on the creative process itself. She would turn off all notifications, close all other applications, and give her complete attention to the single task of creating something valuable. This practice transformed not just the quality of her content, but her relationship with the creative process itself. Instead of feeling scattered and anxious about whether her content would perform well, she began to experience what the ancient texts call flow state or samadhi, that effortless absorption where time seems to disappear and creativity flows naturally. But it was in addressing moha in her content creation that Maya made perhaps her most significant breakthrough. She realized that much of her online presence was built on a subtle but pervasive delusion, the belief that her curated image was somehow more real or important than her actual lived experience. She had been unconsciously editing not just her photos, but her entire life, choosing experiences and opportunities based on how they would look online, rather than how they would actually feel or contribute to her growth. This is moha in its most sophisticated form, not just attachment to illusion, but the gradual replacement of reality with illusion. Maya began practicing what she called radical authenticity in her content creation. Instead of only sharing her successes and highlights, she began sharing her struggles, doubts, and learning process. Instead of presenting herself as an expert who had everything figured out, she positioned herself as a fellow learner, sharing insights from her journey. This shift was initially terrifying for her ego, but the response from her community was profound. People began engaging with her content in deeper, more meaningful ways. Instead of superficial comments and likes, she started receiving messages from people sharing their own struggles and insights. Her follower count actually decreased slightly, but the quality of connection increased dramatically. What Maya discovered is that authenticity is inherently more engaging than performance, because it invites genuine connection rather than comparison or admiration. When we share from our real experience rather than our idealized image, we create space for others to do the same. The ancient principle behind this transformation is called Sattva, pronounced as Satya, which means truth or authenticity. Satya isn't just about not lying. It's about aligning our expression with our deepest truth, even when that truth is complex, uncertain, or unflattering. Practicing Satya in digital communication began to transform Maya's entire relationship with self-expression. She became less concerned with managing her image and more interested in sharing what was actually happening in her inner world. Her content became more nuanced, more human, and ultimately more helpful to others who were facing similar challenges. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Maya's transformation was how she began to apply these ancient principles to address one of the most pervasive issues in our digital age: the epidemic of comparison and inadequacy that social media seems to generate so effortlessly. The ancient texts have a specific term for this tendency: asmita, pronounced asmita, which is often translated as ego or I amness, but really refers to the identification of our essential self with our temporary circumstances, achievements, or social position. Asmita is what causes us to feel inadequate when we see someone else's vacation photos, or to feel superior when our post gets more engagement than usual. Maya began to recognize asmita as the root cause of much of her social media suffering. Every time she found herself comparing her life to someone else's curated highlights, every time she felt her self-worth fluctuate based on digital metrics, every time she felt the need to prove her value through online performance, this was asmita at work. The ancient practice for working with asmita is called atma vichara, pronounced ahtma vichara, which means self-inquiry or investigation into the nature of the self. Maya began asking herself fundamental questions. Who am I beyond my achievements? What is my value independent of external recognition? What remains constant regardless of changing circumstances? This inquiry led her to discover what the ancient texts call sakshi, pronounced si, she, the witness consciousness that observes all experiences without being identified with them. The sakshi is the part of us that can watch thoughts, emotions, and experiences arise and pass away without being disturbed by them. Maya began to cultivate sakshi consciousness in her relationship with social media. Instead of getting caught up in the content she was consuming or the reactions to her own posts, she would practice observing her responses with detached awareness. I notice I'm feeling envious looking at this person's success story. I notice I'm feeling anxious about how my post is performing. I notice I'm feeling the urge to check for notifications. This practice of witnessing without judgment began to create what the ancient texts call vairagya, pronounced vairagya, which means dispassion or non-attachment. Vairagya isn't indifference or emotional numbness. It's the freedom that comes from not being emotionally dependent on external circumstances for our sense of well-being. As Maya cultivated vairagya in her digital life, she found that she could engage with social media without being emotionally hijacked by it. She could appreciate others' success without feeling inadequate about her own life. She could share her own experiences without being attached to how they were received. She could use technology as a tool without being used by it. But the transformation went even deeper than individual psychological freedom. Maya began to see how the ancient principle of seva, pronounced esiva, which means selfless service, could revolutionize her entire approach to digital communication. Instead of asking, "What will get the most engagement?" or "How can I build my personal brand?" Maya began asking, "How can I be of service? What does my community actually need? How can I use my platform to contribute to something larger than myself?" This shift in motivation transformed not just her content, but her entire relationship with online success. Instead of measuring her impact by followers and likes, she began paying attention to whether her content was actually helping people. Instead of focusing on building her own audience, she began connecting people with each other and highlighting the work of others. The results were paradoxical but profound. As Maya became less focused on building her own platform and more focused on serving her community, her influence and impact actually increased. But more importantly, her sense of purpose and fulfillment deepened dramatically. This illustrates one of the most beautiful aspects of the ancient wisdom. When we align our actions with principles like dharma, satya, and seva, external success often follows naturally, but our internal well-being is no longer dependent on it. We find satisfaction in the quality of our contribution rather than the quantity of our recognition. Maya's digital Dharma Sangha began experimenting with collective seva practices. They would coordinate to amplify important social causes, support struggling members of their community, and create resources that would be freely available to anyone who needed them. They discovered that technology could be a powerful vehicle for service when approached with the right intention and skillfulness. One of their most successful experiments was what they called digital dana, using the Sanskrit word dana, pronounced dahna, which means generous giving. Instead of focusing on extracting value from their online presence, building personal brands, monetizing their audiences, accumulating social capital, they began looking for opportunities to give value freely and generously. This might mean sharing knowledge without expectation of return, amplifying others' work without seeking credit, or using their platforms to support causes they believed in. The practice of dana transformed their relationship with digital success from scarcity-based competition to abundance-based collaboration. What Maya and her Sangha discovered is that the ancient principles, when applied collectively, create a completely different kind of online culture. Instead of the typical social media environment of comparison, performance, and extraction, they began to experience digital community characterized by mutual support, authentic sharing, and collective growth. The ancient texts describe this kind of community as satsang, pronounced S-A-T-sang, which literally means association with truth, or gathering with the wise. Satsang isn't just about being around spiritually minded people. It's about creating an environment where everyone's highest nature is encouraged and supported. Maya realized that it was possible to create satsang online when participants approached digital communication with consciousness and intention. Their virtual gatherings became spaces for genuine learning, authentic sharing, and mutual encouragement. Instead of scrolling through feeds full of performance and comparison, they were engaging in conversations that actually nourished their growth and well-being. The contrast with typical social media engagement was striking. Instead of leaving online interactions feeling drained, scattered, or inadequate, Maya found herself feeling energized, focused, and inspired by her digital connections. This is the power of bringing ancient wisdom to modern technology. It transforms not just individual experience, but collective culture. As Maya's practice deepened, she began to explore some of the more advanced concepts from the ancient tradition and how they applied to digital life. One of the most profound was Pratyahara, pronounced Pratyahara, which is often translated as withdrawal of the senses, but really means conscious choice about what we expose our consciousness to. Pratyahara recognizes that we become what we consistently focus our attention on. If we're constantly consuming content that triggers comparison, fear, anger, or desire, our consciousness becomes shaped by these states. If we consciously choose to focus on content that inspires growth, compassion, wisdom, and service, our consciousness becomes aligned with these qualities. Maya began applying Pratyahara to every aspect of her digital consumption. She curated her social media feeds with the same care that she chose her food, asking, "Is this nourishing my consciousness or depleting it? Is this inspiring me to become my best self or triggering my worst tendencies?" She unfollowed accounts that consistently made her feel inadequate or angry, even if they were popular or professionally relevant. She sought out content creators who shared wisdom, beauty, and authentic inspiration. She began following accounts that showcased different cultures, perspectives, and ways of life that expanded her understanding of the world. The practice of conscious consumption extended beyond social media to all forms of digital content. Maya became more selective about the podcasts she listened to, the articles she read, the videos she watched. Instead of consuming whatever the algorithm suggested, she began actively choosing content that aligned with her values and supported her growth. This shift in digital diet had a profound impact on her mental and emotional state. She noticed that her thoughts became more positive and focused. Her mood became more stable and resilient. Her creativity and productivity increased. Most importantly, she began to feel more like herself, less influenced by external opinions and more connected to her own inner wisdom. The ancient texts describe this as developing Svadhisthana, pronounced Svadhisthana, which means self-established or grounded in one's own nature. When we practice conscious consumption of information and experience, we become less reactive to external influences and more stable in our own center. But Maya's exploration of ancient wisdom in digital life led her to perhaps the most transformative discovery of all: the recognition that consciousness itself is the ultimate technology. The ancient sages understood that by learning to work skillfully with awareness, attention, and intention, human beings could access states of clarity, creativity, and connection that surpass anything external technology can provide. Maya began to see her smartphone not as a device that connected her to the world, but as a tool that could either support or distract from her connection to her own deepest nature. The quality of that connection, she realized, was entirely dependent on the consciousness she brought to using the device. When she approached her phone with unconscious habit, it became a source of distraction and agitation. When she approached it with conscious intention, it became a tool for learning, creating, and genuine connection. The technology itself was neutral. The difference was in the quality of awareness she brought to using it. This led Maya to experiment with what she called sacred technology, approaching all digital tools as if they were sacred instruments that required respect, intention, and skillful use. Before opening any app, she would pause and set an intention. After using her phone, she would pause again and notice how the interaction had affected her state of consciousness. This practice transformed her relationship with technology from unconscious consumption to conscious engagement. Instead of being at the mercy of notifications and algorithms, she became the conscious director of her digital experience. The ancient principle behind this transformation is called Buddhi Yoga, the yoga of intelligence or discriminating wisdom. Buddhi Yoga teaches us that by cultivating clear seeing and wise judgment, we can navigate any situation or environment skillfully. The same intelligence that can guide us toward liberation in a meditation retreat can guide us toward freedom in a hyper-connected world. Maya's journey illustrates something profound about the relationship between ancient wisdom and modern technology. The principles that guided seekers toward awakening thousands of years ago are not obsolete in our digital age. They are more relevant than ever. The same forces that create suffering and limitation, tamas, rajas, and moha, are amplified by technologies designed to trigger and exploit them. But the same practices that lead to freedom and fulfillment, sattva, dharma, and santosha, can transform our relationship with these technologies. The path forward is not about rejecting the tools of our time, but about approaching them with greater consciousness and skill. It's about remembering that we are not victims of our circumstances, but conscious beings capable of choice, transformation, and growth. It's about applying timeless wisdom to contemporary challenges and discovering that freedom is always possible, regardless of external conditions. Maya's story continues to unfold, but the principles she discovered are available to anyone willing to explore them. The ancient sages offer us this invitation to wake up from unconscious living and step into conscious choice, to transform the patterns that keep us trapped and discover the practices that set us free, to remember who we really are beneath all the digital noise and mental chatter. The next time you reach for your phone, pause for just a moment and ask yourself, what am I seeking right now? The next time you feel the urge to scroll endlessly through social media, notice whether you're being driven by tamas, rajas, or moha. The next time you post something online, check whether your motivation is arising from authentic expression or from the ego's need for validation. These small moments of awareness, practiced consistently over time, can gradually transform your entire relationship with technology and, ultimately, with life itself. The ancient wisdom is available to us, not as dogma to be believed, but as medicine to be applied, practices to be explored, and insights to be embodied. Maya's story is one story among many, but it points toward possibilities that are available to all of us in a world that often seems designed to keep us unconscious, scattered, and addicted. We can choose awareness, presence, and freedom. We can learn to dance with technology rather than be enslaved by it. We can discover how to stay connected to what matters most while fully engaging with the opportunities of our time. The ancient sages offer us this invitation to wake up from the dream of unconscious living and step into the reality of conscious choice, to transform the patterns that keep us trapped and discover the practices that set us free, to remember who we really are beneath all the digital noise and mental chatter. This is the gift of ancient wisdom in the modern world. Not escape from complexity, but the tools to navigate it consciously. Not rejection of technology, but transformation of our relationship with it. Not perfection, but progress. Not arrival, but journey. The path is available to us. The practices are time-tested. The community is waiting. The only question is, are we ready to begin?